They're associated. Another hint, perhaps, I got one screenshot over there from Teams Admin Center talking about an assigned phone number, and then you see the calling plan type, and then you see the emergency address there. That's all from the user's detail page. If I look at it from the perspective of phone numbers, I can see the assignments, I can see the emergency addresses there. Anyone wish to take a guess at what emergency address is? 3, 2, 4. Okay, how many say number 1? All right, everyone, no one said number 1. How many say number 2? Wow, no one. Oh, a couple, okay. 3, users and phone numbers? Or not assigned, associated. Oh, I caught you, this is so cool. They're actually assigned phone numbers. So you two can argue about it. And you're looking at me weird. You can see it in the phone number. You can see it in the phone number list. We actually associate the emergency address with the phone number, and then that just kind of gets carried on into the user object. And some of this history around the way that this is structured has meant that you haven't had the ability to edit an emergency address because there's been this hard linkage between an emergency address and a phone number. And what was happening is that we would take the emergency address object and we would validate it. And once that validation happened, then we'd be like, okay, cool, it's fine, this emergency address is all good, it's going to operate as expected. And we didn't want the admin to then go behind the scenes and change that emergency address because then it wouldn't be validated. Now, that validation, that upload thing, that's not happening for a whole bunch of regions around the world. And the region list is here. It's pretty broad, like Australia and Croatia and New Zealand and US, Slovenia and Japan. All of these regions now, we're allowing the editing of the emergency address. So it used to be back in the day, if a customer accidentally input the emergency address wrong, or if there was a change or something that they wanted to express in there, the process was, great, create a new emergency address, and then once that new one is set up, then flip all of those phone numbers out. Flip the old emergency address out, put the new emergency address back in. Now, fortunately, for those regions, you don't have to do that. Now, it's not supported in Teams Admin Center yet. It's important to say yet because it's on their list and they haven't gotten to it yet, but eventually it will. But you can get to the pieces that you need pretty easily from TAC. So you can go to TAC and you can get the location ID. From the location ID, you can then do a lookup on the location ID. That's what this screenshot here is for the Get CS Online List location. Civic address, and then the civic address part of that location object is what you can edit. And so when you edit that, you're using a set for the civic address object. Some of you who may be astute and looking at my screenshots can notice, hey, Jamie, it's pretty obvious that these are two completely different PowerShell sessions because they look really different. Why is that? It's because this command has probably a week or so. Our team's doing some infrastructure work in the back end. Turns out that the infrastructure work in the back end, basically paying our taxes on dependencies that the services need to run, well, that ended up breaking this commandlet. And so 2 hours ago, was able to find from our dev team why this is breaking and how to make it work again. So for the time being, two emergency addresses pass in the company name and the country or region parameters. When you pass in those parameters, it bypasses the terrible things that's happening in the infrastructure that causes this edit to fail. If you have any issues with it in the meantime, just reach out, let me know. This is intended to operate as expected. Again, though, only within those regions that we've articulated. Another feature that we've done that has been released out to the world now is around emergency call routing for common area phones specifically. So this is generally a more North American, more US-centric conversation, so apologies for folks from around the world around this. Fundamentally, when we need to be able to get emergency services to a user who's made an emergency call, we have to make sure that the PSAP, the public safety access point, the folks that are actually responsible for deploying fire and police, get the right address information. And that is actually fairly difficult to do. Like they've got to be able to discriminate between, if I'm, depending upon where I am, like do I send fire and police services, from the county? Do I send it from the city? I have an example from the area that I take my hopefully every other day walk in. So at this corner is an intersection where my town, Forest Park, is within King County. The town literally across the street is called Shoreline, also in King County. But if you cross the street the other way, that is a different county called Snohomish. And these are all different. So depending upon where you are in each one of these places, separated by 10, 20 feet, you may have a different emergency agency responding to you, and it's the PSAP that determines where that response is coming from. And so this is something that we suffer over within the company. We want to make sure that when a location is being configured and when a location is being sent up, that we're confident that it's accurate and that it's actually representing the true location of the user. And so there's two ways that then emergency calls get handled. One is they get directly connected to this public safety access point. We're only going to do that, though, if we have a really high confidence that this address is accurate, that this address is going to be, actually represent where the user is. If we have some doubts around the accuracy of the location, what we're going to do is we're going to float this call to an emergency contact center. So it's a contact center, physical people, cheeks and seats, who are going to answer the call and who are going to say, hey, this is, you've called emergency services, we just want to verify your location, this is the information I have, is that accurate? And then from there, then they go and they forward that call off to the PSAP to be able to actually deploy fire and police. So historically, we'll route stuff to the screening broadly based on cases where we don't have a lot of confidence that address is accurate. So if I'm a user and I'm manually editing the address, I instantly don't trust you. If I manually enter the address, I don't trust you as a user. I'm going to first route this thing to the screening center. If the emergency address comes from the operating system automagically, like we've configured it to where the workstation has location set up, we've configured that in the back end, but the user doesn't confirm that, we don't trust it, and we're going to send that to the screening center. But in cases where we do trust that location, because the admins defined it, because it's been confirmed as accurate, or it's been edited through the address auto-suggest mechanism, so it's formatted properly, it's confirmed, we'll route that to the PSAP. The change here is that for common area phones, we're going to now route those directly to the PSAP as well. Because the idea here is common area phones, Microsoft Teams rooms, they're not moving around, right? The reason that we do all of this is because when I have got a Teams client on a laptop or on a mobile device, well, that client can be anywhere. You're not picking up and moving around common area devices. You're not picking up and moving around Teams rooms. So even if you're doing a static assignment of an address now to one of these devices, we will directly send that call up to the PSAP. So to make sure that this is working, first, the fundamental assumption here is your common area phones in your Microsoft Teams rooms that they don't migrate, that they don't move around, that they're going to be chained to the desk or chained to the table or whatever. So for those devices, first make sure that the policy to sign-in mode of either meeting sign-in or common area phone sign-in. Yes, this is yet again another instance where Teams Admin Center does not have this policy exposed. It's something you got to use PowerShell for. But when we see an emergency call come through for a device with that sign-in mode set with either common area or meeting, then we will take the location object that we send up the wire. We will take that and we will automatically stamp that with the parameter that says that this call can now go directly to the public safety access point. So this is how it works now for cases where you've got common area phones and MTRs configured. Somebody in a previous session asked, hey, does Microsoft charge for cases where a call is intercepted first by the contact center and then forwarded off to the PSAP? The correct answer is no. We don't charge extra for that, but this is a way for us to kind of manage that cost, right? Because these devices don't move. There's no reason to interrogate this location again. Because of that, let's just send these calls directly out to the PSAP. Ted. They don't seem to be stationary on a regular basis. That would be my answer. Should they not be stationary on a regular basis, then don't use this. Then don't use that sign-in mode. Cool. Stuff we're building. So those two features, editing emergency addresses, the way that we're doing emergency call routing for common area devices, exists in the world operating as expected. Now we're going to get on to things that are in a kind of general state of development at some level. And so certainly want to reiterate the reason that I have the opportunity to go through this stuff is that I'd love to be able to get feedback from y'all. And given the pace that we're going, I think we'll be able to have a good set of questions at the end. Emergency call notification. So the way that we have it set up for folks to be able to become aware of an emergency call happening in your environment is through the emergency calling policy. And so emergency calling policy, the screenshot there is from Teams Admin Center, says, hey, when we detect a emergency call with this dial string, here's the experience that we want to have happen for folks to be notified. So a notification mode could be that somebody just gets a team message. That notification could be that they actually get a call and that they're connected to the call live and they can interact. And so the way that all this operates is based off of policy that then is assigned to users or it's assigned to the site if you're doing site-based policy. And I thought this was great. I was like, cool, we're done. We don't have to think about notifications ever again. Because we could set users and groups for these notifications to land. And if somebody wants to automate this stuff, well, cool, just slurp it up from Teams and go and do automation on the back end with that. It's really hard, really, really hard. Not well received by customers broadly. So customers are saying, okay, fine, I can go and I can try to stitch together a bunch of stuff, but why bother going through all this Teams thing? I just want to plumb my existing infrastructure, whatever that may be, that I use for notifications around emergency calls. I just want to plumb that into Teams to make sure that, whether it's a report or whether it's other notifications or some whole other software system, I just want to make sure that these notifications are getting out. And so what we did is we took this emergency notification package that we would normally have it go out to a Teams client or be able to fire up calls. And we've created a graph API endpoint. And so you can subscribe to this endpoint, and then every time that there is an emergency call that happens, the endpoint is going to get a notification. So the subscription that you create for this is on a per policy instance basis. Okay, so you can have like maybe 5 or 6 different emergency calling policies configured, but you're only going to be getting notifications from the service for ones that you've subscribed to, right? So if you need to have all of your emergency calling policies be able to fire off graph events, then you need to subscribe to all of those instances. The subscription duration is locked to a day. Apparently, this is a really common thing in Graph. I threw a little bit of a fit with the Graph team and was like, really? Do people do this? And they said, yeah, this is super common. Subscriptions last for a day. After that, you have to just refresh it, and it's not a big deal. So if it is a big deal, tell me otherwise, because Graph seems to think this is all easy and all super straightforward. And fundamentally, the same content that shows up in a Graph notification is the same thing that would show up in a client notification. So we do have some additional parameters that we'd love to be able to get into here. They need to be plumbed pretty deeply throughout the infra in order for that to happen, though. So we're taking feedback on that, but it's something that we're still kind of actively looking at. Documentation's out. It's pretty straightforward. The beta endpoint is available now. The beta endpoint has issues with it. Shout out to Michael for cluing me into global. Global is not able to be subscribed to. Some weird thing where in the pipeline, the global instance shows up as null somehow. And I don't know, anyway, we're fixing it. So the way it'll work, if you need to subscribe to global, you'll just throw global in as the subscription. If you need to subscribe to custom policy instances, they're tag : policy name, kind of standard stuff. We think that this is straightforward. The dev has a fix for it, and he was confident that it was going to be done this month. So I said, hey, May timeframe is when you can expect this will be up and running. We did have an expectation that we would have this feature out this quarter. It looks like it's going to slip into hopefully the second half of calendar 25. So kind of the first part of the next semester, so Q3 calendar is my hope that we'll get this done on. There's nothing functional here. This is all just graph, not necessarily taxes, but making sure that the end-to-end testing is operating as expected. Making sure that that's right. There's a performance piece on this too. Graph endpoints in GA have a slightly higher performance threshold than in beta, and so they want to be able to make sure that they're hitting the performance threshold from a graph perspective. So there is real here, but functionally, if you're thinking about implementing this in your own organization, you're thinking about implementing this for your customers, functionally know that once the global thing is addressed, this will just work. It will work the same in GA, just with a slightly different. So I think it's this the URL is slightly different when you're making the request. The /beta versus /1.0. Yeah. Correct. No call stream that's happening here. It's just the content of the notification. So the idea is that if, I got a customer who they lease the building, and as part of the building lease, there's on-site security, and on-site security uses a proprietary blah, 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 blah. So this is what it's great to plumb into, yeah. You won't be able to pass the call using this, but you can always dial out as well. Like that can work as well from this policy. Cool. on stuff that we're working on. Overlapping subnets. So when an administrator is configuring dynamic emergency calling, what is a set of network information and the physical location that the workstation is supposed to be in, right? And you're doing this so that way, as the phone or mobile device or workstation is floating around the organization and picking up different network information, whether that's LLDP, whether that's the radio address from Wi-Fi, whether that's a subnet, I'm going to be able to match that information accurately to a location. And Teams requires this to be deterministic, right? So I don't have the opportunity to say that today that multiple types of, or that equivalent identifiers can match multiple or different emergency locations. They have to all be unique. So here in this example, I've got two wireless radios, one in Chico, one in Sacramento. They are pointing to two different emergency locations. And so just to kind of go into this, just a tiny bit of kind of what's going on here. When the client logs in, the client's going to be getting from the internal network all the information about its environment that it's sitting in, right? It's going to know what radio it's connected to. It's going to know what subnet. It's going to know switch and port information through LLDP. And then the client takes that network information and sends that up to our service, and then the service says, okay, you're connected to this radio, great. Here's your emergency address. So this is the way that it's supposed to work when everything's golden. The thing is, though, very often that's not the case. Now, the scenario that I hear about the most is ones where if got companies, maybe one company really happens to fancy another company, they decide to merge. When they do that activity, are they going to go back and reconfigure their network? Maybe, but probably not soon. And so you end up with scenarios like this, where I've got 3 different sites, Boston, Berlin, and Bangkok. They all have different external IPs. They're all connecting out to the internet using a express point from that site, but within that site, they all have an equivalent subnet. So imagine the scenario where I, as a Teams user, I show up in Berlin, I open up my workstation, but when I make that request up to the service and say, hey, where's my location? We can't have subnets for Bangkok or subnets for Boston. Those can't be configured in the service today because it can't be deterministic. You've got to today have a match between a unique piece of network information and a single location. So our work is to be able to address literally this scenario. And we're using the external IP to differentiate between sites here. And so in the future, when I, as an admin, and I'm going and I'm configuring subnets, I will have the option to also configure the external IP that matches with that subnet. So that way, when a user is in this topology, we'll have both of these sets of information. We'll have both the subnet information and we'll have the external IP to be able to make the location determination. And yeah, a lot of customers are happen to run into this, and I think it's just a matter of in sufficiently large organizations, networks are messy, networks drift, networks have a tough time, and staying on top of a global network that doesn't have any overlapping subnets is going to be more and more rare. And so being able to have this flexibility, we're pretty stoked about. Also expecting this second half of the calendar year. We've started the development on this, but it is a fairly big big set of work, both in how we define these sites internally, and then how administrators will be able to configure this. Our initial focus is on location matching. We also have subnets defined for policy and location-based routing purposes as well. That is a whole separate set of work that we may choose to pick up depending upon what we hear with regard to feedback on this feature. But right now, we're focusing on the location matching for dynamic emergency calling first. Fantastic question. And for the recording, the question was, imagine a scenario where one site, where sites have backup external IP egresses. How would the location match work in this case? I think in that scenario it doesn't. I'll go back and I'll start having a little bit of the conversation with the engineers. But my sense is that even today, with that, well, it would still show as a trusted IP. I'll have to think about it a little bit. Yeah. External IPs are you configure it like this. Today, though, they're not associated with the subnet. That's the change that this feature will forward. So that way, it'll be the tuple combination of IP and drives the delivery of this location. Also have some difficulty in location acquisition in VPN cases as well. So when the active network adapter is a VPN, the kind of happy process that we saw earlier, that gets a little bit messed up. And so first, when same thing, client shows up and says, "Hey, give me all the network information." Then, though, because the client's running a VPN adapter, what it sends up to the M365 services, where we have our lists and the network configuration service, what it sends up there is not information about the physical network at all. It's the location about this virtual network. So we get the virtual adapter's information because the virtual adapter is the primary adapter in the workstation. Oh, okay. And then the services say, yeah, there's nothing here for you. I'm sorry. We're seeing this more and more in cases where customers are using on-premises VPNs. Just show of hands. Anyone run into organizations that require VPNs on premises? Okay, maybe less than 10%. All right. Yeah, we see this both from a security perspective, like our wireless is zero trust, right? You can get on our wireless and that just gives you internet access. In order to have corporate access to be quote unquote behind the firewall, even if you're on our prem, then you establish a VPN. So we've seen that scenario. I've also seen cloud firewall scenarios, and they fundamentally operate like a VPN. There's a client that's running on the workstation, and then when the workstation is sending that location information up to us, we are just going to be getting the VPN information. And so what we need to have happen here is the media stack collects all the information about what's happening within the corporate network, and then actually sends not just some of the network information, but all of the network information up to NCS. And then at that point, NCS can reply back with an appropriate match. So even if the client is on Wi-Fi, we're sending all the network information up there, the service will see, oh, you're actually connected to this radio. Oh, you're actually connected to this LDP combination of switch and port. Awesome. And so with all that information, then we'll be able to have a more accurate, way to determine location. Also in progress for second half availability, active development that's happening with this work right now. Again, it's kind of deep. This is both, media stack has some work to do, then client has some work to do because it's client's job to go and ask for its location to NCS. Then NCS picks up that and says, okay, when I get a handful of network information, like which one do I take first versus second versus third, that sort of thing. The one thing that we're pretty stoked about, though, we think that there's not going to require a lot of reconfig from an admin perspective to have this work. We think that in general, like once this is turned on, then NCS is going to be responding appropriately with location stuff straight away. Yeah? Okay. For the recording, the comment was, this is something that folks have run into, and that one of the ways around this is by excluding some addresses from the network config from the firewall. And that's just all that I'm going to say about it, because that is in fact not a supported topology. It exists, and it is something that can be configured, and some customers are using it successfully today to deal with this topic. The reason that we're building this is because the workaround that's available has some downsides, and we want to have a kind of proper, appropriate, complete way of looking at this. We also feel like having, like, it's just kind of a more elegant design if we have all of the information about the network and make a more intelligent decision about the network and the location. So we don't think that's in the first part of this feature. We think that straight away that this is just going to work. But we think for the future that there may be some utility to have a more rich set of information coming from the client. In the back. So the question was, for the scenario where you have user who's on a docking station and they're wired on the docking station, but then they pull their laptop off and now they're on wireless. This would also have some applicability in that scenario too. Yes, and I think that there's a client timer piece to this as well. There's some heuristic around the frequency at which the client is curious about location that's independent of network change events. So I think that there's some heuristic in the client that prevents, for example, if the network is bouncing all the time, from the client from always trying to hit the service asking for a location every time that there's a network change event. So there's a timer that's in place there as well that I don't have a lot of details on because it's a client thing. But yeah, there was another customer case that was almost spot on to that, where it had to do with that was it. They are wired, but their wired network map is such a mess that they don't want to represent it in here. They're like, what we want to do with our wired network is let it die. What we want to do is over the long term, move everyone over to wireless. And then the wired network is we just forget about it, right? They would rather do that than map their wired network. And so in that case, what we want to do is, even though active adapter is the wired adapter that's in the workstation on the docking station, we want to be able to do location acquisition using the wireless BSSID. So yes. So not quite the picking up off the workstation, but in that similar vein, like if your customer is going, it's just a lot easier for us to map BSSIDs, and well, yeah, like map BSSIDs and have that be what's determining your location instead of doing the wire map. Yeah. Sure, and so that dynamic side is fundamentally the workstation getting lat long and then using lat long as the query to determine location. We call that the auto suggest method within the workstation. Sure, that I completely hear you with regard to how our workplace norms are changing. What I'm hearing from customers who are saying, boy, I really want to deploy the next, because I have a lot of interest in that difficulty for them, right? So that's a lot of where this is coming from. I think Sure. No, absolutely. And the compliance thing is something that I'm happy not to touch with a 10-meter cattle prod. So yeah, absolutely. But with regard to the topic of, how do we get the right tooling in front of our admins to be able to make some of this stuff a little bit better, the things that we hear about a lot from folks is I've set up my dynamic emergency calling day one. It's awesome. It's working fine. All good. And then day two, somebody paints over a radio accidentally, and that's fine. That's no big deal. We'll just replace the radio. And then once that happens, I'm not getting this. None of this is working anymore, right? Because it's a different radio with a different BSS ID that now is not matching a location because it hasn't been set up in M365 services. Accurate network topologies, this is really hard to maintain. There's no question. It just takes labor. Networks are going to drift. People are going to be painting over APs. And figuring out what's happening in this mix is really, really difficult, right? Like you're immediately kind of dropping into very deep client logging. You're immediately like trying to figure out between, what's set up in NCS, what's set up in my location information service, then what's the client picking up, and is that weird? Are there any kind of weird permissions that are happening on the things? Why didn't the client do this query in the right way? Like all this stuff ends up being a headache to try to manage. And so one of the things that we're trying to do on this is publish all of the match, not match request information up into a report and have that be published within Teams Admin Center. And so the intent for this is admins have something to look at besides super low-level client logs to be able to understand cases where they should have locations matching but don't, or cases where they would expect that there's not a match, maybe because somebody's working from home or whatever the case may be, but a match shows up unexpectedly and inaccurately. There's a tremendous amount of events that are generated here. There's a ton of data to work through, and so there's just a whole lot of tooling that will be in place in these reports to be able to kind of churn through this and look at it from a subnet perspective, from a BSSID perspective, et cetera. Yeah, so you're going to get all the trusted IP information with the match or not match, provided that the client is behind a trusted IP that's registered within the system, right? That's an expected not match case. Is when I'm here, right? I'm in a public wireless environment. I'm in a public network environment. I should expect that there's a not match scenario happening here. But when this workstation is sitting in the cafe of Building 30 in Redmond, well, and if it doesn't match, that's inaccurate. Like, that's a scenario where we should be matching. And so for admins trying to figure this stuff out, there's just been no tooling. So this is our first step of that tooling. Yeah, Torin. Torin's question was, do I get to export all of this? And I will take that as a statement of, Jamie, gosh, it'd be so useful if I had the opportunity to click a button and to have all this stuff exported. So definitely make sure the next time you come and talk to us, you talk to us about the facility to export as well. Is that accurate? Exporting for reports in TAC of experience from the last gig. Exporting stuff from TAC is, it has to be done on a kind of per report basis, but there's no reason that we can't have that as part of, or that timing wise that we understand, you know, what it takes to have the export facility wired up. But thank you for that. Yeah. Is there a priority for subnet versus BSSID? Yes, in that when NCS is evaluating, I think it evaluates BSSID first, but I don't recall. I want to say it's BSSID, then switch, then port, then subnet. Oh, darn it. All right. I was going to say, it was just in the last session that we had just talked about that. Port, switch, subnet. That makes sense, because port's going to be more granular than switch, of course. Thank you. Yeah? What? Oh, yeah.
Import the SSID from the screen to.
Oh, excellent. Yeah, that's actually something that me and the design had talked about. I was really concerned about how fancy we want to be here. I think that's a pretty reasonable scenario, though. Hey, we don't see this BSSID in NCS, so clearly there's, you know, that's something that the client's giving us that we would expect to have matched, and we're not. Yeah, provided that it's, of course, you know, again, sitting behind a trusted IP address. Yeah, I'm torn between having this be just a really efficient report and then having some of the more fancy remediation stuff coming a little bit later. That's what the suggestion here on the last bullet is. This feels very ripe for an anomaly detection type of service, right? Where as this activity is happening across an organization, you're going to be developing norms of, like, you know, we see clients that are, you know, when they show up in these areas that they're getting locations, and that there's a certain amount of volume of that. And when there's an anomaly, when the access point goes away, well, we can detect that anomaly, and then we can potentially alert the admin as a result. So know that this is baby steps for us. Knowing that this is a difficulty, we know that we need to go and fix it, but we don't think this is the end-all be-all, right? We think that the end-all be-all of this is some service it'll probably be a co-pilot, right? That's able to process these events and know when they're going sideways. Not today, because the idea behind associating trusted IP with subnet is to cover the overlapping subnet question. We don't have the same feedback around overlapping BSSID or LLDP. The reason that I mention that is it is a expected no match to have the BSSID that's named after my dog who passed away 10 years ago. Like that's an expected not match, right? Because it's my home network. And so I don't know if off the top of my head if that, I think we are still getting that data, but like the first thing that NCS checks is, oh, is this behind a trusted IP? And then it's an expected not match, right? Because I'm at my house, I'm not a building 30. When everyone's remote, I don't know why you're configuring the list, right? So maybe that's a scenario that we got to talk about more, right? If everyone's remote, are you still in the habit of setting up a definition in your subscription of networks that you're not responsible for? Yeah, Michael. Sorry, say that again? Miss it, like, oh, okay. There you go. All right. Well, that could be an anomaly, right? That I would want a service to pay attention to. And at this point, when I talk about this stuff, I'm like, I've presented this topic to the data scientists who work in our org, and had the opportunity to kind of talk about like, or what could be in the box versus what's out of the box, that sort of thing. So we're still early days in here. But know that we are not happy with a report and calling the problem solved, right? Know that we are going to be happy when we have a report and a service that is kind of doing stuff with you as an admin to make things better. For things that we're planning, have two topics on. Both of them are kind of outside the locations and emergency calling thing, which is kind of weird. These are also areas that I get to pay attention to. Call restrictions. So today, when you want to restrict the ability for somebody to make an outbound call, you do in two different places in Teams Admin Center, because one of those outbound call types is from meetings, and another one are peer-to-peer calls. But what you're doing is you're actually selecting a particular canned instance of a policy object, is CS dial-up policy. You're actually selecting a canned instance of that, and you're applying that to a user, and it works fine. It handles at a high level the ability to manage whether or not you can dial out at all, or domestic versus international, et cetera. But we've had a lot of requests from customers to say, can we see more granularity here? How about based on the time of day or the day of week? So this phone can make international calls during the week, but it can't make international calls for the weekend, as an example. Based on the destination or the number dialed, like I want to have some class of international calling, but not all class of international calling. And then based on the type of call. So do we want to treat this call uniquely because it's actually dialed by somebody, or do we want to treat this call differently because it's a simul ring or a call forward? And there's just a whole lot of customer feedback around to this topic, right? I want to allow call forwarding, but only within work hours. Like I'm not gonna pay for somebody to like have simul ring or whatever when they're not working. I mean, these are real requirements. This is stuff that we hear. Another one that's really common, common area phones, right? Like I want to have common area phones be able to dial anywhere during business hours, but outside of business hours, you can basically just call emergency services. stuff like that. So the stuff we're planning, so there's less active development that's happening here. But the current thinking is to use a new policy object called Teams dial-out policy. And that policy object will actually be, instead of just you grant a kind of pre-cooked instance to a user, you'll actually be able to create that policy instance, just like you do today with calling policy or call park policy or whatever. And then admins will be able to attach to that a schedule that determines when that policy is available, and then they'll be able to attach regex to determine where that call is going to be driven to. So the idea is, if you want to allow something as kind of goofy and granular and specific as only between these hours am I going to allow people to do call forwarding to numbers in Spain, like you'll be able to configure that level of granularity on this. Not saying that that's what all customers are asking for, but the combination of these three different types of thinking, the combination of destination, time frame, and type of call is what we want to be able to put some controls around for the enhanced call restrictions. We definitely don't think that this is going to be done in calendar year 25. There's a bunch of really good here, both in terms of getting this policy up and running and getting it all wired up with the stack, but also unwinding the existing policy, making sure that it's done in a rational way. So a good work here, and in a place that if there's feedback on this topic, more than happy to take that on. Just have a couple minutes left, so I'm going to kind of blast into the last topic on stuff that we're thinking about in planning, and that's around administrative units. Administrative units deals with the way that admins have access to the tenancy. So today, there is some kind of very basic sets of capabilities for being able to scope the access to a tenant within Teams, but we don't have this within Teams Phone. And it's interesting because there's some factors to the way that folks have thought about deploying PBXs that actually makes this particularly painful. Were kind of a function of the site, right? They could come with the building. They would certainly be different across geographies, right? You wouldn't expect back in the day to have a single PBX system that's looking at Spain and US and Japan, for example. And so a lot of times customer IT organizations followed that structure. And so IT organizations were allocated such that they were kind of expecting to have full control over this local PBX that's sitting on their site. And when customers then transition to Teams, they're having to reconcile this and go like, well, Teams doesn't work like this at all. Teams is a single global, single kind of coherent instance across the globe, as opposed to a whole bunch of kind of federated together call processors. And so what we end up getting to are scenarios where customers want to have groups of user devices separated out into different buckets. These buckets are called administrative units. And then you can assign admins, instead of having scope for the entire tenancy, they just for the administrative unit they're responsible for. And that scope can be different based on role, based on their role-based admin control, right? So now, instead of just thinking about administrator capability as a function of I'm Exchange, or I'm SharePoint, or I'm Teams, now it's a union of those two things, right? Now it's a union of that, my RBAC role, and am I looking at the entire tenant, or am I just looking at a set of the tenant? And so Teams has some of this kind of base functionality today, but it's really only in dealing with users and groups. And so there are users, groups, and devices. And so there are some some kind of useful capabilities that are available. So if I'm an admin who's scoped to an administrative unit and I bring up the list of users, just the users in my administrative unit are the ones that show up. If I'm doing devices, same thing, right? I can take these devices, I can have them exist within an AU, and then when I go onto Teams Admin Center, I just see the devices that are hosted in the AU. But we have a lot of work to do to be able to support all the other scenarios of Teams Phone, being able to have support for all the different types of novel objects that exist within Teams Phone. And so when I start thinking about those, they kind of break out into these big buckets. They break out into a bucket of what does it take to enable a user, assign them phone numbers,